And we are going to turn now to a discussion between Amartya Sen and Mark Thompson on the subject of Professor Sen's recent memoir. Amartya Sen is the Thomas W. Lamont University professor and professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University and senior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Among many other appointments, he has also held the position of Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. His research has ranged over social choice theory, economic theory, ethics and political philosophy, welfare economics, the theory of measurement, decision theory, developmental economics, public health, and gender studies. Dr. Sen's many books have been translated into more than 30 languages. His most recent book, the one we're going to hear about a bit today, is Home in the World, a memoir that was just published this year. He has served as president of the Econometric Society, the American Economic Association, the Indian Economic Association, and the International Economic Association. Dr. Sen won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998 and was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1997. Dr. Sen will be in conversation with Mark Thompson, who is a British and American media executive and now chair of the board of Ancestry, the largest for-profit genealogy company in the world. Just prior to assuming this current role, he served as president and chief executive officer of the New York Times Company from 2012, stepping down in the summer of 2020. Mr. Thompson was instrumental in accelerating the pace of the Times' digital transformation. Under his leadership, the Times became the first news organization in the world to pass the 1 million digital-only subscription mark. Before leading the Times Company, Mr. Thompson joined the BBC in 1979 as a production trainee. He worked his way up to become Director General of the BBC in 2004, where he reshaped that organization to meet challenges of the digital age. Mr. Thompson's book, Enough Said, What's Gone Wrong with the Language of Politics, is based on lectures he gave as a visiting professor of rhetoric and the art of public persuasion at Oxford University. He was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 2017. So I will give the stage up now to Amartya Sen and Mark Thompson.
Thank you, Bob. Professor Sen, Amartya, if I may, the first thing I want to ask, this is a highly recommended book. It's an incredibly rich and interesting story of an intellectual and cultural development of a human being. And we learn, I think, a lot about why you made the breakthroughs that you did and had the influence that you've had in so many different disciplines. But my question is the decision that when you get to the end of 400 and plus pages, we've got to 1962, 63, about only a third the way through your life. It's the first third of your life. Just tell us a little bit about why you decided to focus on those very early decades and leave the actually momentous work and achievements and breakthroughs of the middle of your career, and indeed everything you've done since then, leave that either for another book. So what's going on there? Why did you decide to focus on this period and leave us at the end still with you as a young man just about to really get stuck into the work that made you famous?
Well, I got a bit exhausted, I think. And, the first 30 years came slowly, and I was at many places. I was very struck by the fact that I was moving from place to place. I was born in Shantiniketan, which is a university town set up by Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, to which I came back for schooling, but originally not so. And then I went to Dhaka, which is where I was growing up, now the capital of Bangladesh. And at that time, a prominent city in what was India, and then later became East Pakistan, and then eventually Bangladesh. Now, I enjoyed those, and I was learning something in each case. I went from there to Burma with my father, who was, like me, an academic, and he was teaching in Dhaka University earlier, chemistry, in fact. And then when I went to Burma with him to Mandalay, I was very aware of a new country, exciting people, very different kind of taste, food, enjoyment, like music and dancing. And that too was exciting for me. And then I returned to Dhaka, and shortly thereafter went to Shantiniketan to settle there as a student, and indeed for 10 years I was a student and loved the schooling. I have to say that the experience of schooling, the variety thereof, made a difference to me. In Dhaka, I was in what was, from a pedagogic point of view, very distinguished school, St. Gregory's, and it was run by an American foundation. And I enjoyed it, and they produced tremendously good students. And they were very proud of the fact that if you looked at the exam results of the entire state, the top 10 were almost invariably from St. Gregory. But I have to say, not me. And and when I returned to Dhaka, my Dhaka friends had insisted I can't go to India after the Nobel. I have to go first to Dhaka because that's where I'm from. And I went there, and in fact, I had to change plane in Calcutta, but couldn't get off in the Calcutta airport, and then arrived in Dhaka. And the headmaster said, we tried to inspire students by your example. I picked out the old exam papers you had.
So they looked up your marks. They looked up the marks you've got as a pupil there.
And they said that we were somewhat discouraged by the fact that your position was 34 in a class of 37, and I was perfectly happy as long as others didn't bother me. But
you give the impression, Amartya, of a young person who may not be perhaps yet intellectually fully engaged in classwork, and particularly the kind of schooling you were getting in Dhaka, but with an extraordinarily precocious mind. And there's one passage struck me. You had an uncle who was serving time in jail. The British had jailed him essentially for action in support of an independent India. This is 1937, and eventually, with tuberculosis and not long to live in 1937, he's finally released. And he says, you say, however, luckily for me, I did have many conversations with my uncle after he was released, presumably in the short period before he died. And I have some warm memories of listening to him on important subjects such as the unity of India and the political triviality of the Hindu-Muslim division. Now, my calculation is that when you were having those conversations, you were 4 years old. So it may not have been showing in your school marks, but you were clearly a somewhat exceptional 4-year-old.
Mark, you're right. I was 4 years old to start with, but I was growing up. And certainly I was very interested since the riots were beginning and the Hindu-Muslim division. And that affected me very much. And it affected my uncle too. He was not only secularist from the left politically, very keen on independence and very keen on India standing on its own. So all those interested me. You're right, I was young, 4 or 5, and then eventually 6. But I felt that's what I wanted to think about, and the geography of Vladivostok was less interesting to me than all this thing. And I went to Shantiniketan, and something marvelous happened. The library is open shelf. It goes 6 stories. You can go up and down anytime. And I was doing that all the time and just settled myself in various cubicles and got the books out and read what I wanted to read. And that was an enormous reward for my independence that I got when I came to Shantiniketan. And then I made some use of it. I was writing while I was quite young. I wrote History of Calcutta, and I persuaded myself that the idea that the British built Calcutta as a tricentenary, as it's often called, event, wasn't quite true. For about 2,000 years before that, there were settlements there, and there were trade there, and people like Ptolemy wrote about it, and I felt that it's my duty to write something about the history of Calcutta, which I did. I wasn't quite 4 at that time, as you point out, that's probably a negligible age, but I was 6, 7, 8, and by the time I was done, it was probably 10. And I really enjoyed doing something of my own, and I thought that I will continue like that at that time.
And if we jump ahead, this instinct, which comes out, very early in the book, and which you talk about, this openness to new experiences. You're moving as a young person from between cities and cultures and different settings, and reading an extraordinary amount of very diverse literature. You say at the start of the book that the book's sympathies, your sympathies, are with an inclusive rather than a fragmentary understanding of what the world offers, of the world's civilizations. And elsewhere, you talk about the celebration of the dignity of being broad-based rather than narrowly sequestered, or being, suffering from kind of sectarian confinement. And that feels like a story of your attitude to life, not just in this early period, but throughout your life. And indeed, the title of the novel, Home in the World, seems to reflect that sense as well of your personal ability to feel at home in many, many settings, but also your belief in the richness and positive value of diversity, and understanding the diversity of cultures and so on. One thing, jumping to the present day, I wanted to ask you is this feeling of inclusivity and openness to other cultures is probably more under attack now than it's been for many decades, and perhaps even it's one of the periods in your longish lifetime so far where it's been most under attack. And in many settings, the kind of ethno-cultural chauvinism and nationalism which has arisen is very hostile to this idea. In India, one could argue that the government of Mr. Modi is an example of that. You talk, I think, very sadly about Myanmar and the story of Aung San Suu Kyi, for example. But we can see in the conflict in Ukraine, we can see in many Western democracies, these instincts which are, in the broader sense, sectarian and wish to either minimize or even demonize the value of minorities or of other cultures, feel as if they're rising in strength. And I just wondered whether you agree with that, and if so, how you think about that today.
Yeah, not only do I agree with it, I regard that to be one of the central features of India as it is going. It happened in about a month's time. I'm giving a talk here in the South Asia Institute called "Where is India Going?" And that's a question that worries me greatly. And it so happened that question worried me earlier, but my pessimism has profoundly increased over time. And it's not just that I was being a nationalist. My family was, though wanting independence from the Brits, wanted a non-nationalist culture. The house I grew up in Dhaka was called Jagat Kutir. Jagat is the world, Kutir is the cottage. It's the cottage of the world, which my grandfather insisted that is what we are to go into. And in fact, it so happened the Bengali translation of the book will be called Jagat Kutir, named after the old name of the house. But at that time also, I was getting interested in cultures elsewhere, and particularly I was very involved in Arab and Persian mathematics. I was also interested in Chinese development, and I was particularly struck that in 868, which is the time when the first printed book was actually printed. It was done by the Chinese. They had competition. They were Korean, they were Japanese, they were all competing. But 868, the Chinese had a slight margin over the Japanese and the Korean. Indians had started about 200 years earlier, but didn't go very far on that. But the interesting thing, the book that they printed was a Sanskrit book called Vajrachedika Pradna Paramita, the Diamond Sutra, as it is often translated in English. Now, that was a Sanskrit book, translated into Chinese in 401 AD, and then it was translated 11 times before it was printed in 868. And when it was printed, the Chinese had a very inspiring forward to it, where the printer, the great scientist, they were all Buddhist scientists, by the way, Buddhist engineers, and he wrote for revering, for reverence to my parents. And this book is being printed for universal free distribution in the world. So there was this emphatic desire to be heard across the world. And the material happens to be Indian, Sanskrit. Oddly enough, the translation was done by someone who was half Turkish, half Indian. So it was a complete amalgam. And of course, it had a major effect on China about literacy, particularly women's literacy and so on. So all that excited me very much. And I wanted to know more and more about it. I wanted to know how Indian mathematics, which is often overestimated in the early period, in the Vedic period, which wasn't great mathematics. But then from about 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD, it became quite big with the arrival of Babylonian and Greek mathematics in India. But then, after Indians absorbed the Greek and Babylonian, they produced trigonometry, which the Chinese were picking up, the big astronomical board that produced the great Chinese astronomers were all Buddhist trigonometricians from India. And similarly in the Arab world, Al-Khwarizmi, after whose name algorithm is derived, he, like all other Arab mathematicians, knew Sanskrit. So there was a kind of combination, the Greek, the Babylonian, the Sanskritist, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Iranian. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I spent almost, 3 or 4 times as much, paid attention 3 or 4 times as much on that compared with what I was being asked to read, which of course, as you recognize, Mark, in the British period, had a lot of Henry V and VI and VII and VIII.
But what's so interesting about what you say is that it reminds us that the exchange of knowledge and literature and scientific and engineering advances between countries over great distances is not just a modern phenomenon by any means. And I think it also, the other thing that's very interesting in the book is the limitations through much of your lifetime, and indeed you personally encountered this, the limitations of Western perspectives on Indian and other Asian cultures. One of your great heroes, Tagore, is many ways misrepresented and misunderstood as the West, as a very mystical figure, rather than a rather sharp, rational figure. And even at a practical level, when you eventually get to Cambridge University, you have encounters of, I think probably, I mean, certainly would be described now as of racism, but of just complete ignorance. You have a rather wonderful landlady in Cambridge who ends up being a great champion of diversity and the treatment of minorities with proper respect. But she begins by worrying whether your skin color, your darker skin color, is going to in some way come off in the bath, and that you'll come down having changed color. So I mean, but it sounds like the extent to which people in Britain and elsewhere in the West simply didn't really understand race or about cultural depth and the long back history is very striking in the book.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Mark, that you should say so, because it was to me very striking a combination, including my landlord, Mrs. Hanger, that you're referring to. Because on one side, she was worried my skin color would come off. She was also very anxious that I should know how electricity works and that kind of thing. On the other hand, she was, as soon as the question was put to her, she rose to it. And she was a great dancer. She went every Saturday to dance in the local dance club. And she found it very upsetting when people, English girls, were refused to dance with an African man or a Chinese or an Indian man. And she lectured them severely. And so I think it's the same person.
Yes, I think we should talk. We should talk briefly as well about your vocation and the central work that you've done on, in particular, in the area of welfare and specifically development economics, and the choice of subject within economics that you chose. What's interesting about the book is, in many ways, your focus on social choice theory and combining that with a passionate interest, partly inspired by witnessing the Bengal famine of 1943. Your Cambridge advisors and colleagues they're not particularly encouraging about that. And it must have taken great determination and I think of, how people go about finding what to specialize in, where can I make a difference, where can I do interesting new work. You ended up taking a very independent attitude to that and really deciding against advice on following your own instincts.
Yes, indeed. I have to add a certain amount of strength of conviction at that time. But I have to say that what came to me as a very striking feature is that if I was understanding, as I thought I did, how the famine occurred, so did Adam Smith. That it may not have occurred to my teachers in Cambridge how exactly people come to die even when there's a lot of food around. But that wasn't a secret to Adam Smith, and for that matter, to David Ricardo. And they were writing things which in many ways were very far-seeing and yet would not be part of the incorporated text of the basic understanding of economics of that period. So there are very striking things. I remember sitting in my hostel in Calcutta late at night reading Adam Smith on the river and how Bengal, where I came from, was a rich province, mainly to a great extent because the rivers were big, the trade was big, and as a result, the trade were feeding into the prosperity of the region, and people were specializing in very fine textile and other things, and the things were happening to them that should be remembered. So I found, I think I come back to the old question that you raised. It's true that I enjoyed when I was 4 chatting with my uncle and other, and I wouldn't give it up. On the other hand, I really enjoyed most reading books. And there were
And readers of the book will discover that one book, an early book about social choice theory, which you get for a few hours, a friend, or you have it just for a few hours. That book changes your life. We've got time for just for one question. It comes from Howard Earl Gardner. It goes back to that theme of racism. In your memoir, you talk about your travels in early life, including your studies in Britain, where you're invited to join the Apostles, the famous notorious Apostles group in Cambridge. Doubtless you encountered prejudicial racist attitudes and remarks, as Jews like me did, says Howard, and not just from your landlady. What did you think and how did you react to that? That's his question.
Well, of course, as far as the issue of Semitism is concerned, that was quite an interesting question for me, because there were moments when I remember staying up in bed in Cambridge and trying to find out whether I was the only Gentile I knew. and it could well have been. And when I mentioned it to a non-Gentile friend of mine, and he said, you won't count as a Gentile because you are a Hindu and you are, and I said, well, I'm Hindu only in a manner of speaking. He said, you have to be Muslim or Christian or something like that. So we had a good discussion about that. But it was striking for me how a group of people could have been separated out and had got into the real problems that Jews got into in Germany in the 30s, which wasn't that far away from the time when I arrived in England. And so it was exciting for me to know something about a European history, to know various things which I didn't. It didn't occur to me that Maimonides, when pursued by Christians in a negative way, would go to the king of Egypt and then and seek refuge there. So there was a kind of breadth in the world, which I thought somehow we had lost. And the question was, how so? And Semitism also raised that issue because, in India, for example, the Jews came very early, shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, and you had the early Christians and so on. And today, look at that. There's, as you mentioned, Mr. Modi chasing away people who are not like him, like Hindus, or people who are not allowed their independent pursuit of.
And throughout the book, you constantly come back to the on the side of those who believe in live and let live, and more than that you can learn from and get something of real value from the other religion, the other philosophy, the other lived experience. Look, we've only scratched the surface of this book. It's a strongly recommend. It's a very, very rich, interesting picture of a life which, although it only deals with the first third, at least to me, felt like it's a complete story of how someone came to a vocation, but also a set of, in my view, admirable values. So, Professor Amartya Sen, thank you very much for being with us. I'm sure this will continue to sell extremely well. It's a really interesting, beautifully written, often very funny book. Thank you very much for joining us at the APS this afternoon. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Bob.
Thank you very much for your question.
Thanks very much to both of you, but especially to Amartya Sen for this incredible breadth, intellectually, geographically, temporally, and his wonderful sense of our shared humanity. I have to say that I was struck in particular by his reference to repeated references to the library and to books. At last week's meeting of the Society's Library and Museum, many of us got to discussing how our lives were formed by experiences in libraries. And that's just obviously a very key element in the kind of lives that folks like us have lived.